Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. As usual, and I'm sure it's getting kind of boring now, but you have to understand these fundamental principles or you won't make sense of anything. The first principle is that God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's glory. Now, what we're talking about currently is God's foreordination. And the real issue for most people, but particularly for Christians, that divides them regarding God's predestination, His foreordination, is whether men may choose God or God confirms or God chooses men. Who makes the choice? Well, if we're going to view that question from the perspective of this first principle, that God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's, which way do you think it would go? How does God get the most glory? If His plan for the eternal redemption of His creation in order to underscore His grace and His mercy hinges upon the independent, autonomous decisions of men, then when those men decide in favor of God, can they not claim some of the credit for their own salvation, therefore for saving God's creation? The answer is, logically, of course they can. Well, does that not detract from God's glory? Well, logically, of course it does. So can that be true if this first principle is true, that God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's? Well, logically, that has to be false. Men cannot choose God, cannot gain any of the glory for their own salvation without detracting from God's glory. So claiming they're able to do that has to be false. Okay, now we'll move on to the other 7 principles. The second one is the jewel of creation is man. But always man subsidiary, submissive toward God. Never man in the ascendant position. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God ordained Adam's fall. He had to. Otherwise, He's not sovereign. Otherwise, things exist in the universe over which He has no control. And if He has no control, then He cannot predict them. He cannot know them, making Him no longer omniscient. There are consequences to all of these beliefs. All of these principles have consequences. If you don't understand these things correctly, the consequences nevertheless will work out in your life, but they'll work out in wrong ways in your life. Wrong behaviors, wrong thoughts, wrong attitudes, and they'll bring grief and misery to you and your loved ones. That's why we're doing this. It's not because I want to win an argument. Well, I do love to win arguments, of course. That's a separate question. Fourth, in Adam, the entire creation fell, including all of mankind. Fifth, as a result of the fall, God pronounced the curse of enmity between the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, and all those who would be in Him, the elect of God, and the seed of the serpent. That's fallen Adam, and of course the serpent himself, Satan, and all of his demons, plus all of those who remain obdurate rebels until the end of time. This is known as the great antithesis. Sixth, all subsequent human social experience, all of history, is an outworking of this great antithesis between these two divisions of mankind. And all other divisions that we want to paint have to be seen as subsidiary to these two great divisions. They never trump these two divisions. If you see your status as a white person as the first and most important factor in your identity, you're wrong. If you see your status as a rich person as the first and most important factor in your identity, you're wrong. It's your belonging to one or the other of these groups that's the most important factor in determining your identity, and then how you're supposed to act as a result of that. Seventh, the unregenerate are without excuse Paul tells us that God has clearly revealed himself in the things that are made, and that anyone who refuses to see it, suppresses that truth, they do it in unrighteousness, and they're ungrateful. They have exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they are guilty. And last, eighth, this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. The word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Okay, as I said, we're talking about predestination, foreordination, and the objections that people have to those. Basically, Arminians. Arminians are those who believe that man has the free will to choose God while he is yet unregenerate. Okay, he chooses to come to faith out of his fallen nature. An underlying assumption that exists in the minds of some objectors is to imagine a class of human beings that simply does not exist. They imagine people who earnestly desire to do good, but are prevented from doing so by God's previous decree that they perform an evil act. Okay? They imagine people who really want to do what's right, but they can't do what's right. For instance, when it says in Romans 9 that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, that sounds terrible. You mean Pharaoh wanted to do the right thing? He wanted to let the people go, and God hardened his heart? Well, he wanted to let people go because he did not like the consequences of not having let them go. But as time separated him from the immediate poignancy of that result, the things that had happened, a day or two later, they don't seem to be quite so strong. So God allows his natural hatred for God, natural hatred for God's people, to reassert itself, and then he becomes hardened again. God is hardening him because God is allowing his own natural sinfulness to come rushing forth. Okay? God is not forcing him to be sinful. He's allowing it. But there are simply no people who desire to do good, and God won't let them. The truth is, there are only two types of people. Okay, remember? The seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman. That's it. The seed of the serpent, they're cosmic rebels. And while they freely choose to do what they desire, their free choices are always directed away from submission to God's will. The other people, the seed of the woman, now they are free from their sins, and they have the capacity to choose to follow God or not on any given decision that they make. Over time, they become more and more godlike because God is the guarantee of their salvation, and he is going to sanctify them by his Holy Spirit. So this idea that there are these basically good people out there, that they can't do the good that they really intend in their hearts, there is no such class of people. There is no, and listen, anybody who tries to present that, they're lying to you, or they're simply mistaken, and badly mistaken. And they can't make a case for it out of the Bible. There's no way. Now, if they want to reject the Bible and make the case out of their own reasoning, out of their own hearts, well, fine. But where's the evidence for that? Look around you. Where's the evidence for basically good people? Where are they? Rioting in our cities? Yeah, right. Sure. This is what's true. God's precepts are revealed to all. His decrees are revealed to no one. Therefore, men may know what God requires of them in his law, but they do not know his decrees regarding their actions. Hence, God's decrees cannot influence the motives behind men's sinful actions. If God has decreed that that he will allow their sinful impulse to result in sinful action in a certain way, if he has decreed that before the earth was seen in space, that person doesn't know that. So that person is acting based upon his own sinful desires, not upon what God has decreed. This is a matter of complete ignorance to us on earth. We don't know what God's decrees are regarding our next decision. We don't. We know after we've made the decision. Why? Because we decided in conformity with what his decree was. But before we act, we don't know what those decrees are. And therefore, our actions are based upon our own desires, and there's no coercion applied to us. Scripture is also clear that God does not tempt men to sin. That means that in no way does he arouse the evil desires in men that both tempt men to sin and then result in their sinning. You understand? He allows those evil desires to come forth in evil actions. That's true. But he does not elicit those desires. He does not pour gasoline on the fire of their desires to fan the heat, to raise the heat level. No. All he has to do is just remove his restraining hand slightly, and those evil desires burst forth because they're always there. That means that each man is guilty of sin based upon his evil motivations for the sinful acts he commits, not based upon God's using his evil motives to bring about his sinful acts that good may come of them, excuse me, in accordance with God's overall plan. I better drink a little bit or I'm going to keep coughing. Excuse me. Implicit in the assumption that it is a contradiction to say human wills remain free if God directs the sinful acts they freely choose to do, is the belief that if God's decrees necessitate their actions, then they must also motivate their actions, making the actions then no longer free. However, let me go over that again to be sure you understand that. Because God decrees something, then necessarily you're going to do what he has decreed. Okay, that doesn't mean that you're compelled to do it, but it means necessarily you're going to do what God has decreed. Why? Because he knows the end from the beginning. He knows what you're going to do. Because he knows what you're going to do, then necessarily you are going to do that. But there's a difference between necessity and compulsion. Remember, he doesn't coerce you to do it. Necessarily you will do it, but you will do it out of the necessity of two things. First, you'll do it out of the necessity of God's decree, because what's going to happen is what's going to happen. He knows what's going to happen. It's going to happen. You're going to do that. But the other thing, the other necessity, is your own desires. Now, guilt is not incurred because God has decreed it happening. Guilt is incurred because your motives to commit a sinful act come out of your desires, not out of God's necessitating that it should happen. Therefore, you're guilty. For moral responsibility to exist, it is only required to show that the motives for acting sprang solely from your desires, flowing out of your nature, not out of God's decrees necessitating your actions, and that no coercion was applied by any outside agency. If nobody was coercing you, and you had these evil desires, and those evil desires resulted in your decision, then they necessitated your decision, not God's decree. So you bear the guilt, not God. God is free to use your sinful actions that he has necessitated by his decree, but you have necessitated by your evil desire for his good purposes. These are not contradictory statements. They require a little precision of thought and self-discipline. Listen, being smarter than everybody is way overrated. Let me tell you what's way more important than being smarter than other people. It's being disciplined in your thinking. It's like one's ability to run fast, okay? It's great to have natural ability. But if you have natural ability and you don't discipline yourself to train well, then you're not going to become near the runner that you could have been. But if you discipline yourself, if you have a much, much more disciplined regimen that you follow in your training, and if you're much more attuned to your own body's requirements in training, and you discipline yourself to follow those requirements, you will achieve much more success than someone who doesn't do that, but who had more natural ability. So the natural ability doesn't matter. What really matters is what do you do with it? And what you do with it is largely dependent upon the self-discipline you bring to it. The same thing true here. If you discipline yourself to make the distinctions that are true and to keep those in your mind as you contemplate these questions, then you won't get lost and you will understand things that you wouldn't understand otherwise. Does it matter whether other people can come to understand those things quicker or easier than you can? No. There's always going to be somebody smarter than you and always going to be somebody not as smart as you. That doesn't matter. You're not required to be as smart as somebody else, but you are required to use what you have as well as you can to understand by the light you're given. If you don't do that because you don't discipline yourself to pay attention and to follow the process each time, to make the distinctions and to maintain those distinctions in your arguments, in your thinking, then you're going to be confused and it's your fault. And you can't go to God and say, well, you didn't make me smart enough. He made you just as smart as he made you. Question is, what are you doing with it? It is irrelevant that their choices are necessitated as well by God's decrees, so long as they are also necessitated by their own desires and are freely and voluntarily made by them with no external coercion forcing the choices. Perhaps an illustration will help. Okay, think about this. If I lie to someone because I'm a coward, okay? My cowardice, desiring to lie rather than to be courageous, necessitates the lie. But the lie is not compelled by any agency outside of myself. God, decreeing that I lie, neither compels my cowardice nor compels me to lie. Although I lie both out of the necessity of God's decree and the necessity my cowardice imposes upon me, I lie both freely and entirely unaware of God's decreeing that I lie. Okay? I'm not aware that God has decreed that I lie until after I lie. All right? Why did I lie? Well, my reason for lying was because I didn't want to have to face whatever consequences telling the truth existed, at least in my mind. All right? So instead of being courageous and facing the situation, I lied to get out of it. Right. Who's responsible for my lie? I am. Who decreed my lie? God did. Who lied? I did. Who's responsible? I am. Does that make sense? For his good purposes, in order that good may come of it, God decreed that I follow my fallen desire and lie, despite the lie violating the ninth commandment. I freely chose to lie. God is blameless. I am blamed. I hope that makes sense to you, because that's really the issue. Additionally, in our own experience, it is not unusual to find people who are slaves to their addictions, to such an extent that their choices are necessitated by those addictions. You know, the drunk who says, I'm not going to drink again, I'm not going to drink again, and then that night he gets drunk all over again. Why does he get drunk? That part of him didn't want to get drunk, but his addiction necessitated that he get drunk, because his addiction really means that now he's in a position where the desires flowing out of his natures are so strong that they necessitate him getting drunk. All right? He's not compelled by anything outside of himself. This is all in him. Who put the addiction in him? Well, he did. Okay? When people talk about alcoholism as being a disease, I find that a peculiar thing, because it's the only disease I know of that you have to go out and visit a bar or go buy liquor in order to get the disease, that you have to pay and then you have to pursue the disease before you can catch it. It's kind of a funny thing, huh? Now, if we mean that it is out that you are not at ease anymore, you are diseased, well, that's true. But if we mean that it is something that happened outside of your control, that's not true. Now, if we mean that once it happens to you, there are things that you can no longer control, well, that's true. That doesn't mean, however, that you're not responsible to control them. You are. If because you're drunk you drive your vehicle and you kill somebody, you're not off the hook because you're drunk. You're still responsible. There are no examples of man's laws excusing evil choices because of the force of the addiction necessitating the evil choices, so long as the addiction was the result of free, uncoerced choices leading to the addictive behavior in the first place. Now, if I kidnap you and I tie you up and I don't feed you anything and I keep injecting heroin into your veins, well, it won't be long before you become addicted. And then once I have you addicted, maybe I can get you to do what I want you to do. Well, in that case, then of course you're not responsible for the behaviors that flow out of your addiction because you did not choose to become addicted. And the law recognizes those exemptions, those exceptions. However, all cultures uniformly condemn evil choices stemming from voluntary addictions and hold those who commit such behaviors culpable. They're guilty, without regard to whether the internally compelling nature of their addictions necessitates their actions. Okay? When the drunk says, well, look, I know I ran into the guy and I killed him, but you have to understand, I really, 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 really needed to drink tonight, and I needed to get smashed. Okay? Well, that may be. But what made him really, really, really need that? Well, it was something inside himself. It wasn't somebody pointing a gun at his head. There was nobody outside of him saying, you have to do this. It was him. He did this, and he's responsible for killing that guy. Now, the real puzzle, and it does not involve contradiction, is how men can choose to act freely and sinfully, and at the same time, God also decreed that they make those choices and perform those actions. I've come up with a model which in my mind helps me to understand, and I may have already discussed this in an earlier podcast, I don't recall, but I'll talk about it again. I imagine a large lake contained by a huge dam, okay, and the dam is God's restraining grace, right, which he does not have to have erected. He doesn't have to make this dam. The lake is the sum of all of our evil desires. Okay, you got all these evil desires in this huge lake. And God, because he's a merciful God, because he's a gracious God, he has built a dam around this lake. But in the dam, there are sluice gates. A sluice gate is something that can be opened in a dam and allow the water to flow through. All right? Now, God didn't have to create the dam, okay? And he certainly was not required to make a dam that had no sluice gates. But now we have a dam and it does have sluice gates. But he maintains pressure against those sluice gates so they don't open. Your desires are not flowing out of them as long as he maintains pressure against this sluice gate. He's not required to do so because grace is not owed. Remember, it's a gracious act of God to restrain your evil. So graciously, he has these sluice gates and he holds pressure against them so that your evil desires won't rush forth. But when it suits his purposes, in order that good may come of it, he relaxes his force against the sluice gate, and what happens? Well, the evil desire that's behind that sluice gate comes rushing forth. Whose evil desire was it? Yours, or in my case, mine. Who's responsible to restrain that evil desire? I am, or you are. Who's not responsible? God. God is not responsible to restrain your evil. I'm reminded of a young lady who had been, quote unquote, a believer, and she engaged in some behavior that harmed her, and after that, she was angry at God because he hadn't restrained her in the behavior that she had engaged in. God was mean because he didn't keep her from doing harmful things to herself. He didn't have to. Who was supposed to keep her from doing the harmful things to herself? Her. But he becomes a handy scapegoat. And we often want to do that. We want to make God the scapegoat for our own evil. That's getting it all wrong. Okay? Here we got this dam, all these sluice gates. God didn't have to create a dam. If he hadn't created the dam in the first place, what would be flowing all the time out of us? Evil. And it would continue to rise and rise and rise. That's what existed before the flood, the great flood. That's why he destroyed all of humanity, because they did evil continually. That's what it says. Now, we should be grateful that he has created the dam, and we should be grateful for every time that he restrains an evil act that we would have done. However, for us to be ungrateful to him for not restraining our own evil is nonsense, and it's ingratitude. Because of God's grace and mercy, which are by definition not owed, but freely given or withheld by God, he often, or even usually, restrains the evil by keeping the gates closed, even though he bears no obligation to do so. When, for his good purposes, he relaxes his control over any specific gate, quite predictably, the man's evil desires go rushing forth into sinful action. It is God's restraining grace, which is not owed, that is withheld. It is man's sinful desires, which are culpable and continually seeking expression and are the responsibility of the man himself, that rush forth into sinful actions. Hopefully that will help you to understand responsibility and guilt, God's grace. This is not saving grace. This is only his restraining grace, keeping our evil from overcoming the world. And right now you can see that he has withheld his restraining grace across our land, and that evil is just absolutely overflowing. It's rushing forth in wild abandon. So is this God's fault? No. He didn't have to restrain any of those evils ever at any time. So when he shows what happens when he lets us be who we really are and how ugly that is, to blame him because he's backing off and saying, all right, you want to be ugly? I'm going to let you be ugly. Well, whose responsibility for our acting ugly is it? It's us. The question of responsibility and guilt should be clear, because God owes no duty to graciously restrain man's sin at any time. His failure to do so cannot result in his culpability. God's withholding of restraining grace in no way prompts the sinful impulse of the sinner. Okay? Because God allows that gate to open because of the pressure against the gate of the man's own sinful desires, what forces the gate open? It's the man's sinful desires. It's not God's removal of his grace that was keeping it closed that forces it open. That kept it closed. What forces it open is the man's evil desires. Now, God's removal of his grace merely actively permits that sinful impulse to express itself in action. Tomorrow, we'll talk about why God doesn't restrain all evil. Certainly he could he not? Why doesn't he restrain all evil? Well, obviously the first reason is because he doesn't choose to, for his good purposes. Well, that doesn't seem good to us. Well, does it seem good to you when he restrained your doing something that you really, really wanted to do, but it was evil? It didn't seem good to you at that time, did it? Now, later on, you thought it was good. So, we'll talk about that. Bill, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just remember later time tomorrow.
Huh?
Later time tomorrow.
Oh, good. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we're having our prayer breakfast tomorrow, and so we'll be a half an hour later. We'll come on at 7:30 instead of 7, and I hope to see you there. I won't actually see you. I hope you'll see me here. We used to saying it the other way around. At any rate, God bless you today and keep you safe. And remember, the worst thing to fear is not death, it's living a faithless life. God bless you.